Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Why Authors Write. Thanks for joining us. I am your host today, Sarah, and I am joined with scientist, award-winning author, and eldritch monster, Premee Mohamed. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invite.
Just to start us off, I'm just absolutely amazed with all that you've written and created and published and won and were a finalist for in 2025. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And also, I know that's a follow-up from a very busy 2024 as well, which also incredible. So it comes as no surprise that the very first thing that I want to ask you about is your writing in general. The podcast is Why Authors Write, but right now I want to know how you write. What is your process? Your setup, your style, or, is it different every time?
Yeah, the answer, I guess depends on what I'm working on. In a lot of cases, if it's a novel, I've kind of got my usual sort of novel process because I started writing novels. That was how I started writing when I was a kid. I didn't really do the, short stories or whatever and then move up to novels. Novel was always kind of my natural stride length. So the first one I finished was when I was 12 or 13. Terrible. Extremely, extremely terrible. Blatant Lord of the Rings ripoff with, I think, even more characters. Um, but I usually I start with my idea. I usually move to research and outlining at the same time so that they can kind of work together. When I have sort of a structure that I like, I usually go through and write my first draft, let it sit for a bit, then I self-edit pretty rigorously, and then that goes off to my agent or my editor. For short stories, it's really all over the map. And what that mostly depends on is where the idea came from. In some cases, it'll just be like a scrap of an idea, half a sentence or something. And if I find that I'm fixating on it, my first response is not like, oh, I'll just, set this aside. It's how can I make this into a short story? So the other day, there was something from a book of, I believe, Egyptian mythology and history that I was reading about. And there was just a sentence that said something like, at night, the sick would sleep in the dormitories, hoping to be visited by a god in their dreams. And I thought, that's so evocative. This is a part of history. This is something that really happened. You would go and you would hope that the gods of healing would come heal you in your sleep. But I kept thinking, what if you go to one of these dormitories and the god never visits you and you dream of other things and you watch as your sick or wounded or disabled friends come in and they get healed and they leave and you're still there. What does that tell you about your faith or the gods or your illness or the dormitory or the priests or the whole setup? I couldn't stop thinking about it. But again, with that kind of story seed, you don't really have a plot. You just have kind of a setup. And I so often just have these ideas that are just the start. I have a setting. Well, that's not a story. I have an idea. That's not a story either. I have a character. That's not a story. So the first step is often just trying to wrangle what I've got and what I haven't got and trying to figure out how to turn that into something that has a beginning, middle, and end.
And I loved how you mentioned how you fixate on something. And that kind of leads me into my next question, actually, of, creating your story titles. I mean, you have some of the most unique and interesting story titles that I've seen in a while.
Yeah, good question. God, I have a friend who every time either she or I starts to work on a story or finishes a story, we get into our messages and we're like, titles are our nemesis. I hate coming up with titles. I would say probably 90% of the titles that I've come up with for novels, novellas, short stories, etc. I kind of did at the last minute, and I never really felt fully happy with them. Unfortunately, I have no talent for coming up with titles, except that if one happens to strike me, I generally know if that's the one I want to go with or not. But that
Mhm.
means that I end up doing a lot of like brainstorming and throwing things out and coming down to deadlines to come up with titles for other stuff. I find titles very, very difficult. My friend and I joke about, let's just use something from Shakespeare. Shakespeare won't mind. Let's grab something from Moby Dick. Let's grab something from another piece of poetry. I don't know. I don't like doing it that way. I like something that's specific to the story I'm telling or the book. It's so hard.
I guess now that we've talked a little bit about how you write and create your titles, um, it's a good thing to get into what you write and why. The first novella that I ever read by you was The Butcher of the Forest. The Butcher of the Forest is this dark fantasy fairy tale-like story that focuses on main character Varys Thorn and her race against time to find and retrieve two children, son and daughter of her land's governing tyrant, in a magical forbidden forest that people never return from, which is so interesting. And for me, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about this story and where your mind was when you were writing it.
I had a lot of fun writing this one. And my assumption when I had the initial idea was not ever that it would get picked up and published. I just really wanted to finish it and see what would kind of happen with the idea, because the idea for The Butcher of the Forest came from a dream. Um, I was dreaming. I was standing in a place. It was lit by firelight. I could see the firelight flickering on the walls. The
Mhm.
walls were made out of stone, and there were skulls on the walls. And I was like, I am in the place where somebody very, very bad lives. Somebody
Yeah.
not very nice lives here. I don't know who, but someone behind me was also saying something about whether the sins of the father should be paid for by the children. I, and I turned to see who it was. There was no one there, and then I woke up. So it was quite a creepy dream, just long enough for me to realize where I was and for someone behind me to speak. So I wrote it down on the notes app on my phone and was like, wow, that was so creepy. That would make a good little short story. But
Yeah.
then I kept thinking about it. I'm like, that horrible wall. Who does that? Like, what is wrong with you? And for this idea, I began to kind of reverse engineer it. Like, okay, the walls are stone, they're clearly stone. So maybe we are in something old, a castle or a fortress, not something modern. They're using candles, they're using fire. Um, we are in a place with somebody who's very, very unpleasant. Who lives here? Whose children are we talking about? What are the sins? So I kind of poked at that until it had the shape sort of a fairy tale, and I wanted it to feature a main character who wasn't aware that she was in a fairy tale. And when I sat down and kind of looked at the idea, I was like, okay, this is not a short story, but it isn't a novel either. So I'm just going to write this as a novella. And I wrote out my little outline. It wasn't very long, it was less than a page because it's just a novella. I got very, very excited about it. And I think that same weekend, I posted on social media something joking about how I was writing this story that was like a cross between Escape from LA and Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. And all my friends were like, yeah, that's awesome. Go for it. Go for it. And I'm like, I hope my agent doesn't see this. And then someone wrote, well, if you are going to write that, I would like to read it. And I almost wrote back, oh, yeah, well, and then I stopped and deleted it because that turned out to be one of the acquiring editors at Tor.com. So,
Oh.
word to the wise, editors can see your social media. So, because I was so jazzed about the idea and because I wanted to capture that kind of dreamy fairy tale like feel, I rushed to finish that one. So, I think that was like 3 weekends or like 4 weekends that I worked on it for, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours a day. So, not very long. I cleaned it up
Here.
and um, I sent it to my agent with a screenshot of that message to be like, I swear I am not making this up. This editor actually did, respond to me. Is it okay if we send him this book before we send anybody else. And he was like, "You're supposed to be working on something else," which is true. I was on deadline for another novel, but I had to get this one out of my system. I didn't feel like I was rushing the writing of it, but I
Mhm.
felt like I sort of had to hurry before like real life kind of jumped on me again and like crushed that sort of dreamy fantasy feel out of it. Because you know that happens too. Like you lose your passion for a book, and then you try to get it back, and you're like, well, this point where I started writing again doesn't sound like the point where I stopped, and that's just very annoying. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted it to feel like the same book from start to finish.
Exactly. The basis of the story comes from the dream you talked about,
Hmm.
but the forest, the creatures, the rules that are in the story. I mean, were there aspects that you took inspiration from?
Um, Definitely, I wanted it to feel like those 80s movies that I grew up on. So like Labyrinth and Legend and The Last Unicorn, and like The Dark Crystal and all those movies that kind of came out around that time and were very magic is real, evil is real. This forest is something you're gonna have to figure out how to get out of. But you can if you keep your wits about you, even though the game is rigged. And I know most of those movies were trying to suggest that that was their theme or their message, but that was always what I took from that is that the game is rigged. The
Yeah.
game is rigged because the things that live in the forest lie. They don't even obey their own rules. Those are just the rules that people think they've figured out. And they don't apply to things that are not human, kind of. So that's really where that came from. I wanted to write something that felt like a fairy tale, but also acknowledged that in fairy tales, the logic works a little bit differently. And that was kind of what I wanted to subvert there for sure. It, yeah, a lot of it just came out of the imagery of those movies and of books like that. And you know, again, we were talking Shakespeare, even things like A Midsummer Night's Dream, where people are constantly checking to see if they're dreaming, and things that seem like tricks or pranks aren't that funny, like lives are being ruined. And it's also very, very much based in kind of the magical realism genre of Latin American writers speaking about colonialism and the atrocities perpetrated by colonial regimes against people who are already trying to scrape out a living, generally in a place that has been colonized a bunch of times. It it's such an interesting genre that I knew I couldn't write in it, but I wanted to sort of pay homage to it if I could because those books are so fascinatingly matter of fact
Yeah.
about the fantasy elements, about the magical elements. It's not meant to be genre fantasy. It's meant to be realism um, with magic. And I thought, you know, if I can even capture a tiny portion of that, I think that would be amazing.
That's so interesting. But also, I know that fantasy is just one side of your writing. I'd say besides the genre, you also really champion science fiction, um,
Yeah.
which brings us to your recent novella with conclusion in the annual Migration of Cloud series, The First Thousand Trees. It's a series featuring a post-climate disaster apocalyptic Alberta, where our main character, Reed, and her best friend, who is also a main character in book three, Henrik, live in a campus community where most people in the world now, actually, including Reed, are infected with a mysterious parasite called Catastrellomyces. I mean, I've been saying Catastrellomyces in my head, so that's
Hmm.
what I've gone with.
Yep.
But also, called CAD for short, which makes it a lot easier to reference. But these are the main aspects that underline the series as a whole. And of course, each novella centers on its own life-altering, earth-shattering journey and realizations. But I guess to get into a question for you, I have to ask, once again, where did you get the inspiration for this trilogy? I mean, what drew you to apocalypse, especially climate disaster apocalypse? I know you have a science background, and I
Mhm.
wasn't sure if that was, a main inspiration or something that was just there to help contribute.
Second thing, I think, because when I had the idea for this, it was actually, it started with the disease. So
Huh.
this was going to be the first one, which was intended to be a standalone and have that very, very kind of open ending. Um, and I wanted it to be kind of, yeah, literally a disability book, a book about the chronic illness and chronic pain that I was trying to wrap my head around. So yeah, it was one of those cases where I was like, I'll process this in fiction rather than going to therapy. But I had been diagnosed with just a couple of related chronic health conditions, and I was very much in denial. Like, oh, well, there's a cure, right? And they're like, well, if there was a cure, we would not say chronic illness. And I'm like, uh-huh, where's the cure? Um, so I haven't gotten better. I've gotten worse. I am still probably a bit in denial. What I wanted to write about was someone who had a disease where you couldn't be in denial about it to some aspect because you can see it, and for people to not really know um, how it's affecting them or how it will go on any given day. So um, there's a very, very widespread theory based on the research that was done kind of before everything collapsed, that the parasite, the fungus, is controlling people's behavior, possibly controlling their thoughts. And of course, there's a huge variety of parasites of all different types and sizes that do that in nature and do that in humans, do that in insects, in plants, in animals, in all sorts of things. The more research you do about it, the grosser it gets. But it also kind of leads you to wonder, what of me is really me? So that really was what I wanted to explore. So initially, my first kind of cut at the story was setting it in the past because I didn't want people to know really, like, I didn't want there to be a cure. I wanted it to be incurable. So I thought, okay, let's set it in a time where it can't be cured. But I thought, no, let's set it in the future. And then I couldn't think of a future realistically that did not have climate change and climate disasters. So I thought, well, okay, that actually works though, because then this global pandemic of this disabling and terminal disease makes responding to climate disasters much harder. And the climate disasters make responding to the disease much harder. They act as multipliers on each other until everything kind of falls apart and nobody can put it back together. So that eventually was the setting I decided on. I did not intend for it to be climate fiction or eco-fiction. I just meant for it to be set in a future where the worst had kind of already happened and we were talking about rebuilding. Um, and then when it did get picked up by the publisher, ECW Press, they were like, we're going to lean really hard, though, on the climate fiction aspect of it, because this is how we're going to market it.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay, because that book actually got picked up in late 2019. We signed the paperwork in January 2020. So that was actually before my first novel had come out, which was in March 2020. So I really didn't know how much I should, advocate for myself or push back or ask the marketing department to change anything about anything that I was doing. My agent kept being like, yeah, just if you're not happy with something, just speak up. And I was like, okay, and then I would not say anything. So I think though I was really happy with how that turned out. That first book, it felt very quiet, very kind of self-contained. It's really about a young woman kind of struggling with herself. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? Is it going to be what everyone tells me to do
Mhm.
or what I want to do? And I think that's kind of a universal question to address, really, no matter, whether you're disabled or not disabled, or whether you have overprotective parents or an overprotective community, or whether the world has ended. So I really had to be talked into sequels because I did not want to write a sequel. I wanted for people to not know at all what happened to Reed. I wanted for that to be wide, wide open. It's a happy ending if you want it to be happy. It's a sad ending if you want it to be sad. Um, just that's the whole point, is that life is full of possibilities. And she's just given herself, a whole suite of them. Um, and then boom, the book ends. But then my editor came back and was like, sequels, please. We'll give you a small amount of money. I'm like, I want a small amount of money. The way she really talked me into it was not so much, don't you want to continue Reed's story? I was like, I kind of do because I love her. She's a character I care about a lot. Um, but don't you want to explore this world a little bit more that you built? You've dropped hints about what other people are doing and how other people live now. Um, do you want to show that? I'm like, yeah, I kind of do. I kind of do want to show that actually. And people sometimes ask why the third book pivoted away from Reed over
Mhm.
to Henrik. And part of the answer is that I wanted to explore how Henrik's people now lived. And as you can tell by the end of the second book, logistically and geographically, there was no way I could pull Reed, like grab Reed and make her go there.
And then one other question is, now knowing that you had never even planned on this being a series, but still being able to, explore this world. And I mean, you've been writing this for 4 years now, right?
I remember this. This one specifically, this one was finished in August 2019. I hadn't decided what I wanted to do with it. I don't even think I had edited it at that point. It was just raw material. And so, yeah, it got acquired right away. But usually it's between 18 to 36 months between when you sign a book deal and when the book comes out.
Mhm.
So I did not know that my book about a plague was going to come out during a plague, or that the next two books would either. But yeah, it wasn't until I think late 2022 or early 2023, even possibly, that we started talking about sequels. It was signed in a one book deal. It was not signed as a trilogy. So the other two books were picked up later, and I was like, well, I'll do my best.
Yeah,
But it's been a couple of years. It's been 3 or 4 years. I'm a different person than when I wrote that book. And my editor was like, do your best.
do your best.
My big hope was that we would be able to get the same cover illustrator as we did for that first one because I loved that cover. And we did. Veronica Park, who is based in Toronto.
Well, now that we've discussed all this, how are you feeling now that it's come to an end? Like, it wasn't intended to be a series, but you've spent so much time in this world now, and now it's finally over.
Yeah, my editor and I talked about that too. Jen and I got very emotionally attached to these kids.
Mm.
Just very bittersweet. I was happy with the ending of the third book. I think it tied up the threads that I meant to be tied up, and it left the threads hanging loose that I wanted to be loose. And also, Jen said that she cried her eyes out, and I was like, so success? I don't know, but I already miss them. I think, maybe in the future it would be interesting to see how they, turn into adults. These are very much coming of age stories, but they end kind of at the point where that turning point happens. And we
Mhm.
don't really get to see them grow up and continue to make hard choices and continue to learn more about themselves and about the world they live in. I missed them instantly as soon as I wrote the end, but I was happy that they got the stories that I intended for them to get and that they sounded like the stories in my head.
You have written so much. Is there, are there any plans, anything that I should be looking forward to?
I have another novel coming, a full-length novel coming out in September 2026, and that is called WICKHILLS. It's a magical urban spy story, uh, sort of set in something that I intended to look like Manchester around the time of the Industrial Revolution or a little bit later.
Mhm.
There's a lot going on. It's a good thing it's a longer book.
Oh my, it sounds great already. No,
It was billed as And I don't think it can measure up to this because these are two of my favorite works, but it was billed as John le Carré meets Gormenghast. And I was like, I can kind of see it. It is a spy book. There's international intrigue. There's betrayals and there's double crossings and there's a lot of spycraft and following people. Kind of the magic is all around us, and it messes things up, and we're not really in control of it. The best we can do is kind of roll with the punches. So I guess it is like Gormenghast in that sense. But I think it is a lot to live up to.
Well, knowing I already know about your books and how you picture them, perceive them, and then go for them, how they're written, I don't know if it's a lot to live up to. I think you might get it.
Fingers crossed, fingers crossed. I'm really happy with it. I think it turned out quite fun, quite cool. And yeah, we'll see you in September.